Good evening. It's nice to be back with you, back in my home after spending a week down in Arizona, which was very warm, shall we say. I think we averaged probably 108 or 110 over the course of the week. So, middle of August is not the most ideal time to go to a desert, I suppose, but that's what worked. So, if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and be opening to Job chapter 3. That's where we'll be spending our time this evening. Mike talked about some big picture ideas about the book of Job, and I'm going to do the same, but use the chapter 3 as a kind of catalyst for that idea. In Job chapters 1 and 2, after we've read the first half of it in the scripture reading, you're waiting in suspense eagerly for the second half, which we start reading tomorrow. Uh, I'll spoil a lot of that and where this book is going if you don't know this already. Job has been a righteous man, and the book opens that way in chapter 1. He's righteous, he's a man of complete integrity, chapter 1 and verse 1. He fears God, he turns away from evil. Job is a righteous man. He's been blessed with a large family. He's been blessed with much affluence. He has a lot of herds. He has a lot of property. He has a lot of servants under him. He's very, very wealthy. And so Satan approaches God. And Satan asks God, what if we tempted him? What if I went down there and removed all that and took all his blessings away? Would he still be faithful? And God allows that temptation to go through. And the solution is at the end of chapter 1 and verse 22. Throughout all of these things, all of the difficulties Job faces, having his wealth removed, having his children killed, all 10 of them taken away from him, throughout all of this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. And so you see the character of Job, a righteous man. In chapter 2, it's much the same. I had Andrew read most of chapter 2 for you. Satan comes before God and says, okay, we didn't get him the first time, but what if I try it again? What if I hurt him this time and take away his health and his well-being personally instead of just his stuff? Surely he can't be righteous after that. But again, he seems to be. In the end of verse 10, Job says, in talking to his wife, should we accept only good from God and not adversity? And throughout all of this, Job did not sin in what he said. And so you see the righteousness of Job again. He doesn't know that God and Satan are talking about him in the background in the heavenly realms. He only knows what he can see, which is he's lost everything, and yet he seems to be righteous, at least for now. Because his friends come by, 3 of them at first, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they come by and they meet Job and they sit with him for a week. Spend 7 days in silence. And at the end of 7 days, nothing's changed. And you'd think that God, seeing his righteous servant suffering, you would think that God would care enough to step in and do something. But he hasn't. And so Job starts to complain. Justifiably so in many cases, although what you'll see tonight is not entirely so. That's the situation setting up chapter 3. When chapter 3 and verse 1 says, after this, it's talking about a week of silence. Let's read chapter 3 together before we go and talk about these verses. Job chapter 3, let's start reading in verse 1. After this, Job began to speak and cursed the day he was born. He said, may the day I was born perish, and that night that said, a boy is conceived. If only that day had turned to darkness. May God above not care about it, or light shine on it. May darkness and gloom reclaim it, and a cloud settle over it. May what darkens the day terrify it. If only darkness had taken that night away. May it not appear among the days of the year, or be listed in the calendar. Yes, may that night be barren. May no joyful noise be heard in it. Let those who curse days condemn it, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars grow dark. May it wait for daylight, but have none. May it not see the breaking of dawn, for that night did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide sorrow from my eyes. Verse 11, why was I not stillborn? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me? Why were there breasts for me to nurse? Now I would certainly be lying down in peace. I would be asleep. Then I would be at rest with all the kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruined cities for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Why was I not hidden like a miscarried child, like infants who never see the daylight? Therefore, the wicked cease to make trouble, and there the weary find rest. The captives are completely at rest. They do not hear a taskmaster's voice. Both small and great are there, and the slave is set free from his master. Why is light given to the one burdened with grief, and life to those whose existence is bitter, who wait for death, but it does not come, and they search for it more than for hidden treasure, who are filled with much joy and are glad when they reach the grave? Why is life given to a man whose path is hidden, whom God has hedged in? I sigh when the food is put before me. My groans pour out like water, for the thing I feared has overtaken me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I cannot relax, nor be calm. I have no rest, for turmoil has come. And it's at that moment where Job's friends interject and they start the debate back and forth. And of course, it's a fruitless debate. But maybe just hearing those words, it starts to make sense why someone would have some strong objections to what Job just said. And they weren't right in everything. In fact, they were pretty wrong on almost everything, or maybe everything. But I at least appreciate the heart behind it. Because when you hear those things from Job, some of that's justified, and some of that really isn't. And so, as we talk about Job chapter 3, this is very strong language. Note that it's poetic. It's much more poetic than the literal histories we've been going through in the last few books. But even so, he's asking some pretty important questions. And to understand his questions for this and for the rest of the book, to understand where Job is coming from, to understand why God is allowing him to suffer, to understand what God is really even trying to do with the book of Job and why we have this recorded, we'll go ahead and walk through this text. I don't have much of a PowerPoint. I was pretty late putting this together, but this will do to highlight the different sections that are in the chapter. You start out with the first 10 verses in which Job utters a curse. And it's a very odd curse at first. He curses the day he's born, his birthday, in verse 1. Job began to speak. After all this silence, he sits, he's contemplating for a whole week, and then he decides to curse his birthday because, as a brief summation statement of this chapter, being born is the worst thing that ever happened to Job. Or at least that's what he thinks, right? If he hadn't been born, he wouldn't be facing any of these problems. And so that's how he starts this off. And he curses the day he was born, but he does it in a very interesting way. He says in verse 3, "May the day I was born perish." And so it's a personal curse. But then he starts calling some witnesses in on this day as well. In verse 4, he says, "If only that day had turned to darkness, may God above not care about it. May God curse the day that I was born." That's pretty strong language to call God's curse down on something that God has not cursed. But God does not like causing suffering for people, and so maybe you can understand why this day should be cursed. Secondly, he calls a curse from nature in verse 6. "If only darkness could take that night away, may it not appear among the days of the year. List it not in the calendar." Right? May nature itself, the rotation of the sun, may it just forget that this day exists and skip right over it. It's pretty strong language. That would be miraculous. He's almost calling for miraculous intervention to remove this day of his suffering. But it's more than that. It's in verse 7 as well. Yes, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout be heard in it. In other words, humanity, humankind, curse the day that I was born. May God ignore it. May the calendar ignore it. May other humans have all their joy taken from them on this day. This is a horrible day. It's a day of suffering. It's a day of cursing. You see the strength of Job's language, and maybe that makes us feel uncomfortable. I think it should. I think there is a problem here because Job is attributing all these things to him being born. He's inherited trouble by the fact that he's born. He says as much in verse 10. The reasoning behind all of this, why is he calling this curse? Because that night didn't shut the doors of my mother's womb. Because I was born. May the entire world and everything in it and the God who made it and the people on it, may they all curse this day. Does that feel weird to you? It does to me. Maybe you start seeing a problem in Job here that gets extrapolated through the rest of the book. You know, when God comes down to correct Job in the later chapters, especially chapters 40 through 42, and that section over there, what does God correct Job on? It's his pride, right? He's thinking more highly of himself than he ought to think. But that's not a plot twist that happens in the late 30s or the early 40s of the chapters. That is something that's revealed right here in chapter 3. Because you start thinking, what is he saying? He's saying that God should curse this day because it was inconvenient for me. Nature itself should morph around me. People should give up their joys and happiness. They should throw away those things because I am suffering. And that's a little bit self-centered, I think, for Job to base so much on himself. It's an issue that arises. It's a little thing here, but it grows throughout the rest of the book. Don't be surprised when he's prideful later on and when that rears its ugly head more obviously, because it all starts here with just a little seed of an idea. We're called to rejoice in the days that the Lord has made, called to be glad in those things, and yet Job curses it, calls God to curse it, and generally just disdains the day of his birth. That gives you hopefully a good idea of how Job is feeling. And maybe it gives us a good metric to judge him by. He's feeling rejected by everything. At this point, he's been through a whole lot in the past, I don't know how long. It hasn't been very long, I don't think. But God, from Job's perspective, he's perfectly righteous and everything is fine. And then one day, God removes all of his wealth from him and all of his children as well, just to add insult to injury on top of it. And then the next day, it seems, almost the very next day, his health is removed from him. And now he's suffering. And then he sits for a week in silence and contemplation and meditation. He sits with his friends. I imagine he's probably praying and doing self-reflection, trying to figure out what he did wrong to deserve this. And the answer is nothing, particularly. Nothing he did brought this about. And so why hasn't God come down and said anything? Why hasn't God spoken to him like he will later on in the book? Why has God not intervened? I don't know. And suddenly he starts to feel abandoned. Did God not see chapter 1 in which he stayed faithful? Did God not see chapter 2 in which he rebuked his wife and stayed faithful to the Lord even though family told him otherwise? Does God not appreciate him? And the work that he's putting forward, it's not an accurate view of what God's doing, but it's quite understandable. Have you ever felt that way? Why am I suffering? Because, I don't know, I haven't done anything wrong. Why does God not care about what I'm going through in this moment? It's not accurate, but it is understandable. And maybe you can start to relate to a little bit of what Job's been through. He feels angry. He's made to suffer. Why does everybody else get to rejoice and I can't? Why does everyone else have a joyful shout and I have to be in the cursed day that there is no joy? Why is it me? You ever ask God that? Why does everybody else get good things while I seem to get nothing? It's not perfectly fair, but it is what Job is feeling. And as you go through the book, that's the mindset of Job as he's going through it. Sometimes you can have feelings that are correct. You can have ideas that are correct. It is unfair. It is unjust that Job should have to suffer this. There is a problem there. But he takes it too far. And he starts asking God why. He starts questioning the character of God rather than being faithful. And his sight slips from the Lord. He starts looking at the things around him, and suddenly he goes down a path that takes him far from God. He's upset, understandably so, and he wants to know why it happened. And so he starts to question God, and that's the reason these questions are so strong. You get the first question. In verses 11 through 19, he mentions it several different times and gives some explanation, some additive stuff around that. Here's the basic question. Why didn't I die at birth? Oh, that's a pleasant viewpoint to have on your life. Why did somebody bother keeping me alive? Why couldn't I have just died when I was young and then not had to suffer this? Because Job's suffering is at the point where he would rather be dead than alive. He's suffered so much, he's been through so much, he would rather just be done with it all. And so he starts talking about the blessings of death, taking this very depressing look at the world. In verse 13, he talks about the blessing of death that is rest. In verse 13, if I had been allowed to die, verses 11 and 12, if no one had taken care of me, then I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep. I would be at rest, and everything would be okay. The world is not gentle. The world is not easy. Even though we want it to be, it's not. And Job has a point to some extent. If you're dead, you don't face the misfortunes of life anymore. If you're dead, you don't have to face the difficult times. And in many ways, the Bible raises this point. God made this world difficult. And there's a purpose behind that. I did a class on Ecclesiastes recently. Ecclesiastes 7 stood out to me. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13, talks about humanity not being able to straighten what God has made crooked. That means God made some things crooked. What is that? It's verse 14. God made the day of prosperity and he made the day of adversity as well. That's a difficult part of life. But God made that on purpose. There's a reason for it. God built some things in this world for humans to suffer through. And you ask, what's the purpose behind that? Why do you have to suffer? Well, I mean, the easy answer for that is that discontentment in this life makes you look towards the next life. Even though Job doesn't have a clear picture of that, he's still immediately doing it. He's saying, it's so hard right here. Why don't I just move on? Why don't I just go to the other side now? And as you go throughout the book, he talks language of resurrection. I'm ready to be done with this life. I'm ready to be wherever's next is better. Job starts looking towards the future. He is discontent because there's rest in death and there's nothing in the here and now. Life is difficult on earth. Suffering has this meaning, but it only has meaning when it's grounded in eternity. So why can't I be there? Of course, the problem with that is, as much as there is a blessing in death, you only can appreciate the beauty of rest when you live a life that's lacking rest. And so even as he wishes for death, he wouldn't even wish for it if he didn't have life. There might be a blessing in life as well. We'll pick that up in a minute. There's another blessing in death. He mentions in verses 17 through 19, there's a blessing of equality. It finally happens in death. There the wicked cease to make trouble. There the weary find rest. The captives are completely at rest. They don't hear a taskmaster's voice. Both small and great are there. The slave is set free from his master. In death, it's a point raised also in Ecclesiastes, it's the great equalizer. In death, no one is higher than someone else. No one is better than somebody else. Evil or righteous, slave or slaver, small and great, all are equalized. Because death comes for every human being, and that's ultimately one of the ways in which we're all the same. Right? When there's death, there's no more abuses. There's a blessing in that. There's no more class division when you die. You're all dead before God. There's no more slavery. There's no more violence. There's no more difficulty in that. There's no more struggle between humans. There's a blessing in death. That everyone is free. Of course, they're free to do nothing. Because you don't live after you die. Of course, there's freedom to do what? Well, nothing really. And so, again, you see the value of life. Even a living dog is better than a dead lion, also Ecclesiastes. Death is free. It frees you from this mortal coil, but it also means you're free of the ability to choose and to do things. There's a blessing in life as well that Job doesn't seem to appreciate. In his anger at the situation, he has lost sight of the big picture of the blessings that God has given him. And so he has to ask this question. He's talking about how blessed death is. He didn't stop to ask the question, is death actually a blessed thing? Because having no pain is wonderful, right? Being delivered from difficulties is absolutely wonderful, but you don't have joy either. You can't join in any celebrations either, at least until Judgment Day, but that's a whole different matter. later on down the line. Death is not a gaining of peace necessarily, unless you're right with God. Death is not a free ticket out of the suffering of earth. A lot of people think it is, but it's not. Death is the point at which you are locked in to go and face God's judgment, to go and be one with the Lord or be rejected if you have gone against him. Death is the end point where you don't get to make choices anymore. There's a seriousness to this that Job is not appreciating. When he looks at how difficult his life is, he wishes for death, but he doesn't understand what he's asking for. And you see that play out across the book. He doesn't understand what God is doing. There is a blessing in death, but there's also a blessing in life. Because death is what takes you to the judgment day. While you're still alive, you have time to correct yourself and make yourself ready for that day. And so when he asks the second question, in verse 20, he starts asking a question: why are those who are suffering kept alive? Why is light given to the one who's burdened with grief, life to those whose existence is bitter? If life is just suffering, in other words, why am I left here? Why not just kill me now? Why does God torment people? In verse 23, that seems to be the implication. Why is life given to a man whose path is hidden, whose God has hedged in? God has a hand in this. Why is he preserving me if all I'm going to do is suffer? I've reached the point where I'd rather be dead than alive. Or so he thinks. Because when you actually look at the character of Job, he is not a man who would rather be dead than alive. I know that's what he says up front. That's not what he means. And you start to see a little bit of maybe a hypocrisy in Job, where he says one thing. He says, I wish I was dead, but actually he means something else. He doesn't wish he was dead at all. If Job just wished he was dead, why wouldn't he take his wife's advice in chapter 2 and verse 9? Right? Go curse God and die. Okay, then go to it. He doesn't do that. Why not? Because you receive from God good and you also receive from God adversity. Why does he not do it? Because he doesn't want to die. He wants to understand. There's a reason he starts asking questions. Right? This book does not end in chapter 3. This book goes another 40 chapters. Why does it take so long? It's because he's always pushing. He wants to know. Why am I suffering? I am innocent. Why am I suffering? If he just wants to die, why is he protesting against all these things? And yet he does over and over again. I don't deserve this. I need an answer to this. He says he wants to die, but he doesn't realize that he doesn't appreciate the curse that there is in death. That when you die, there is no more life to enjoy those blessings that you have. And as small as they may be, and as difficult as life may be, there are still blessings to enjoy. He wants that. At the end of the book, you'll see him restored twice what he lost. And everything, all the animals that he had, even the children that he had, twice of all of those things. And then he lives a long and prosperous life, an enjoyable life, a life after the suffering. I'm sure there were still bad things that came after, and yet he enjoyed some time afterwards. Because like many of us, he's so focused on the current situation and the current difficulty, he convinces himself that he just wants to die and get out of it, when in fact he wants God to take him through it and deliver him on the other side. Be careful what you wish for. Because if God had followed Job's words, he would have struck him down and Job would have lost everything. Job would have been delivered to judgment day in a sinful state. Be careful what you wish for. Maybe we should be hesitant to take those kind of requests to God. Job sees in verse 26, he sees there is this blessing in death and he glorifies it. In verse 26, he's talking about his life right now. I cannot relax. I cannot be calm. I have no rest. My turmoil has come. These difficulties are here. Everything is terrible. If I just died, all of this would be over. I sigh when the food is put before me. In verse 24, my groans pour out like water. If I could just die, I would be delivered. No more sighing, no more groaning. And yes, that's true. But there's also no more food. There's also not the ability to taste anything. There's also not the ability to share a meal with friends. There's also not the ability to have people around you. There's also not the ability to meet with a church. There's also not the ability to glorify God. There's also not the ability to do anything because in glorifying death so much, he has forgotten the blessings that are in life. And too often we look at difficult times in our lives and we start focusing on what is so bad and so terrible in the moment that we forget to look forward to what God has given us. That even in the worst of times, you're still alive. Even in the worst of times, you still have people around you. Even in the worst of times, you still have life and breath and can do things. Why not be thankful for what you have instead of angry for what you don't? But that's the trap Job falls into because he takes his eyes off God and starts focusing on the problems in the moment. You remember the example of Peter out walking on the water. He's doing just fine. He's very faithful to Jesus. He's looking to Jesus, walking out on the water, and everything's fine until he looks at the wind and he looks at the waves. He takes his eyes off of God, and then he starts sinking because he's lost sight of the big picture. I think that's what's happening to Job. He's a man, he's a faithful man, he's a righteous man, and yet he has lost sight of what he should be focusing on. He's lost sight of who God is and of the fact that God is with the righteous. He saw a bunch of curses headed his way. He thought they were from God. He kind of denounces God almost, failing to appreciate that God is the one who's keeping him alive. Fails to appreciate that God put limits on Satan, that God would not allow Satan to strike him down. He fails to appreciate that God has left some things in his life. And the fact is, God could at any moment strike Job down just like Job asked, but instead God keeps him alive and gives Job the understanding that Job asked for. And he does not appreciate it. And he whines and he complains about the terrible situation of his life in chapter 3. But by the time he gets to chapter 42, he has that understanding of God that he wanted. The understanding which says, I don't understand God at all. This is a lifelong pursuit. And he recommits himself to the Lord. In many ways, the suffering of Job serves to clarify what he actually wants. He wants life, he wants understanding, and God allows that, but only through suffering, to teach him some lessons about who God is, to teach him some lessons about how to humble himself. Maybe to teach Job the lesson of Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 2, do not be hasty to utter things before God, because God is in heaven and you are on earth. And instead of taking Job away to Judgment Day where he would be caught by surprise by his secret pride, God spares his life even through difficulty and uses this to expose his weaknesses. Uses this to correct Job, a judgment before the Judgment Day, so that Job can be right with God before he dies and is eternally set to stand before the Lord. That's what God's doing in the book of Job. Job doesn't appreciate it. He opens this book, he is rash, he is angry, and we feel like he has a right to be. But he doesn't understand what God is doing because God is much bigger than he is. God is much wiser than he is. Job is generally righteous. He is attacked by Satan. He's allowed to undergo suffering, and it shows us and it shows him that just a little bit of suffering makes him angry and upset. That he's not quite as committed as he wants to be. That he's not quite as committed as he thinks he is. And maybe he's not quite as righteous as he thought and imagined. God is using the suffering to clarify Job's position, but also to build up his righteousness, to restore him to a right relationship with God. The call for us when looking at Job is not to look at his friends and condemn them for being foolish. You can do that, absolutely. That's not the real point of the book. The job of us looking at the book of Job is not to look at this and find every single answer about who God is and how God works and the problem of suffering and find out all the solutions. You can make some suppositions, but that's not what the book is about. The book of Job is about a righteous man who thought he was righteous until God showed him otherwise through suffering. And it's a call for reflection. Are you really righteous? Or would God maybe have a thing or two to say to us as well? God doesn't want us to be like Job, unaware of the problems in our lives. And so before Judgment Day, God will make it known to us, the difficulties, the issues, the sins that we have before him. The question is, do you want to undergo that search willingly? Do you want to choose to undergo that? Do you want to choose to go through your life and figure out what's righteous and what's not and how to follow the Lord? Or do you want to make God push you to the limit? Do you want to encounter that suffering and then be forced to reckon with God when he is trying to forcibly correct you? And I don't know about you, but I'd prefer the former. And so that's the question of Job is what do you actually need to change to be righteous before God? Death is not going to solve your problems, and ignorance of God isn't going to solve your problems either. The only solution you have is to seek the Lord and understand who he is. He has a plan for you. He planned things out. He's the one you're going to face at Judgment Day. It would be much better for you to understand him and go to him with a knowledge of who he is, rather than being surprised. Is that something you're willing to think through? Is that something you're willing to pursue? Is there anything as you evaluate your life that you know needs to change right now? Because if you do need to change something, if you need to fix one of the problems, there's an opportunity for you. It's always present, but let's go ahead and offer it right here at the end of the sermon. If you need the prayers of the saints, if you need to convert and be a Christian in the first place, if you need to be faithful to God, and maybe even you think you are, but you know there are a couple of things that are holding you back. If there's something that's getting in the way of a relationship between you and the Lord, let's get that fixed, even tonight. Don't make God come down and do it for you. There's a blessing in life. You still have time to make that change. And so come down, come talk to me. I'll be standing right here as we all stand and sing this song.